The cabin in the woods, a nightmare we couldn't escape. Emily Davis was enjoying a quiet Saturday morning in her cozy apartment in Riverside, a peaceful suburban town that had always been her sanctuary. The sun streamed through the large kitchen window, casting a warm glow over her breakfast table. She had just finished her coffee and was about to start her daily writing session when her phone buzzed on the counter, its screen lighting up with an incoming call. "Sarah," Emily muttered to herself, recognizing the name of her longtime friend and fellow horror enthusiast. It was unusual for Sarah to call so early in the morning, especially on a weekend. She picked up the phone, a smile tugging at her lips as she answered. "Good morning, Sarah. What's up?" "Emily, finally. I've been trying to reach you since yesterday." Sarah's voice was filled with a mix of urgency and excitement, making Emily sit up straighter in her chair. "Sorry, I've been busy with some last-minute edits. Is everything okay?" Emily asked, a slight frown crossing her face as she tried to gauge the situation. "Everything's fine, but I have news. The writer's retreat has been moved up. Can you still make it?" "The retreat?" Emily echoed, her mind racing as she tried to remember the details. She had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. It was supposed to be a gathering of horror writers she had met online, all of whom shared a love for crafting spine-chilling tales. They had planned to meet in person for the first time, a chance to connect beyond their virtual chats. The retreat was supposed to be in a couple of weeks, giving her plenty of time to prepare. "Why the sudden change?" Emily asked, her excitement tempered by confusion. "Apparently, everything's ready sooner than expected. The cabin was available earlier, and everyone else is good to go. We're heading out tomorrow," Sarah explained, her voice bubbling with enthusiasm. "Tomorrow? That single quote says ... Sudden," Emily murmured, already running through her mental checklist. She didn't have any pressing deadlines, and a quick glance at her calendar confirmed that her schedule was clear. "I know it's last minute, but we couldn't pass up the opportunity. It's going to be amazing, Emily. Just think about it, finally meeting everyone in person, sharing our stories in the perfect setting," Sarah continued, her words weaving a picture that Emily found hard to resist. "All right, count me in," Emily said, a grin spreading across her face as she made the decision. "I'll pack tonight and be ready to leave in the morning." "Fantastic. I'll send you the address and all the details. We're meeting at the old gas station on Route 23 before heading up to the cabin. It's pretty remote, so we'll caravan together." "Sounds like a plan," Emily agreed. "I'll see you tomorrow." As she hung up the phone, Emily's excitement began to build. The retreat was something she had been looking forward to, a chance to get away from the routine and immerse herself in the eerie atmosphere that was sure to inspire new stories. The fact that it was happening earlier than expected only added to the thrill. She spent the rest of the day preparing, packing her bags with all the essentials: clothes, notebooks, her laptop, and of course a few good horror novels for inspiration. By the time she was done, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the town of Riverside cloaked in the soft light of twilight. As she stood by her window, looking out at the quiet streets, Emily couldn't help but feel a strange twinge of unease. The retreat was supposed to be a fun, creative escape, but something about the sudden change in plans left her feeling slightly off-kilter. She shook her head, dismissing the thought as pre-trip jitters. After all, what could possibly go wrong? The next morning, Emily awoke early, her excitement mixed with a lingering sense of unease. The sky was still a soft shade of gray when she loaded her car with the bags she had packed the night before. As she pulled out of her driveway, the streets of Riverside were quiet, the early hour lending an almost eerie stillness to the town she knew so well. Her GPS guided her to the old gas station on Route 23, a place she had passed by many times but had never really noticed before. The station was small and weathered, with faded signs and rusted pumps that looked like they hadn't been used in years. A few cars were already parked there, and as Emily pulled in, she recognized Sarah's bright red SUV. Sarah was leaning against her car, her phone in hand, looking up every few seconds as if she were expecting someone. When she saw Emily, her face lit up with a broad smile. "Emily, you made it," Sarah exclaimed, waving her over. Emily parked her car and got out, feeling a bit more at ease now that she was with a familiar face. "Of course, wouldn't miss it for the world," she replied, returning Sarah's smile. "Come on, let me introduce you to the others," Sarah said, leading her over to the small group gathered near the cars. There were 3 other people, all of whom Emily recognized from their online chats, but had never met in person. Mike, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his mid-30s, gave her a nod as she approached. He was known in their group for his intense and often disturbing stories, a stark contrast to his friendly demeanor. Next to him was Jessica, a petite woman with dark hair and a sharp wit that often had the group in stitches during their late-night discussions. Finally, there was Daniel, a quiet but brilliant writer whose psychological horror stories often left Emily sleeping with the lights on. "Emily, this is Mike, Jessica, and Daniel," Sarah said, pointing to each of them in turn. "Everyone, this is Emily, our resident ghost story expert." Emily chuckled, shaking hands with each of them. "It's great to finally meet you all in person." "Likewise," Mike replied, his voice deep and warm. "I've been looking forward to this trip for weeks." "We all have," Jessica added, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "It's going to be amazing." Daniel simply nodded in agreement, his expression calm but focused, as if he were already deep in thought about the stories they would create during the retreat. "So, where exactly are we heading?" Emily asked, glancing around at the deserted gas station. The location felt oddly fitting for the beginning of a horror story. Sarah pulled out her phone and opened a map. "The cabin is in the Appalachian Mountains, about 3 hours from here. It's pretty isolated, no neighbors for miles, which makes it the perfect setting for our retreat." "That sounds delightfully creepy," Emily said, only half joking. The idea of spending a few days in such a remote location with nothing but their imaginations and each other's company was both thrilling and unsettling. "Trust me, it's going to be great," Sarah assured her. "The cabin is old but well maintained, and the surroundings are just beautiful. Plus, the isolation will help us focus on our writing without any distractions." "Or interruptions," Mike added with a grin, his tone suggesting that he was already thinking of ways to incorporate the setting into his next story. With the introductions made and the plan set, the group piled into their cars, with Sarah leading the way. Emily followed close behind, her thoughts racing as they left the gas station and headed toward the mountains. The road wound through the countryside, the landscape gradually shifting from open fields to dense forests as they climbed higher into the hills. The drive was peaceful at first, the early morning fog clinging to the trees and giving the world a dreamlike quality. But as they drove deeper into the mountains, the road became narrower and more winding, the trees pressing in on either side, their branches forming a canopy overhead that blocked out much of the morning light. After a while, Emily noticed that the road signs became less frequent, and the houses they passed were fewer and farther between. It was clear they were leaving civilization behind, venturing into a part of the world that seemed almost forgotten by time. About 2 hours into the drive, the paved road gave way to gravel and then to dirt, the path becoming rougher with each passing mile. The trees here were older, their trunks thick and gnarled, and the underbrush was dense, making it difficult to see more than a few feet into the forest. Emily's unease grew with each bump and turn in the road. The sense of isolation was becoming palpable, the world outside her car feeling increasingly wild and untamed. She glanced at her phone, no signal. It wasn't surprising, given how remote they were, but it still sent a shiver down her spine. Finally, After what felt like an eternity of driving through the woods, Sarah's car slowed to a stop in front of a large wooden gate. The gate was old and weathered, with moss growing along its base and thick vines twisting around its posts. Beyond it, Emily could just make out the roof of the cabin peeking through the trees. Sarah got out of her car and opened the gate, waving the others through. Emily followed the narrow dirt path until it opened up into a small clearing where the cabin stood in all its rustic glory. The cabin was exactly as Sarah had described, old but sturdy, with weathered wooden walls and a stone chimney that looked like it had seen countless winters. A large porch wrapped around the front, with a few rocking chairs that creaked gently in the breeze. The windows were dark, reflecting the surrounding forest, and the whole place had an air of quiet, almost eerie solitude. "Welcome to our home for the next few days," Sarah announced as they all got out of their cars and took in the sight of the cabin. "It's perfect," Jessica said, her voice hushed as she gazed at the cabin with a mixture of awe and trepidation. "Definitely has the right atmosphere," Mike agreed, already pulling out his camera to take pictures. Daniel remained silent, his eyes scanning the cabin and the surrounding woods, as if trying to absorb every detail. Emily stood by her car, her heart racing with a mix of excitement and apprehension. This was at the start of their retreat, a place where they would write, share stories, and perhaps uncover a few secrets along the way. But as she looked at the darkened windows of the cabin and the dense woods that surrounded them, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were not as alone as they thought. The clearing around the cabin was small, barely large enough to park their cars and give them room to maneuver. As the group began unloading their bags, the sense of isolation deepened. The dense forest surrounding them seemed to absorb all sound, leaving only the rustling of leaves and the occasional distant bird call to break the silence. Sarah, always the organizer, took charge. "Let's get settled in and then we can take a look around. There are 4 bedrooms, so we'll have to double up. The kitchen should be stocked, and there's a fireplace if it gets cold." "Sounds good to me," Mike said, hefting his duffel bag over one shoulder. "I'll take the room closest to the front door." Jessica laughed, planning a quick escape. "Always be prepared," Mike shot back with a grin. Emily followed Sarah up the steps onto the porch, the wood creaking underfoot. As she passed by one of the windows, she caught a glimpse of her reflection, her face pale against the dark glass, her eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and unease. Shaking off the feeling, she pushed open the door and stepped inside. The interior of the cabin was exactly what she had expected, rustic and old-fashioned, with wooden beams across the ceiling and a large stone fireplace dominating one wall of the living room. The furniture was a mix of worn leather and plaid fabric, comfortable but clearly well used. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and pine, and the only light came from the dim, filtered daylight streaming in through the windows. "This place is great," Jessica said as she wandered into the living room, her voice echoing slightly in the large, open space. "It's like something out of one of our stories." "Yeah, it has that perfect blend of cozy and creepy," Mike agreed, dropping his bag next to the couch. "You can almost hear the ghosts whispering in the walls." "Let's hope that's all we hear," Sarah said with a chuckle, though Emily noticed a flicker of unease in her friend's eyes. Daniel had been silent since they arrived, his gaze fixed on the dark corners of the room as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. "I'll take the room in the back," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sure thing," Sarah said, her tone brisk as she tried to keep the mood light. "Emily, why don't you room with me? We can take the upstairs bedroom that has the best view." Emily nodded, grateful for the offer. "Sounds good." As they split up to claim their rooms, Emily and Sarah headed upstairs. The second floor of the cabin was smaller, with a narrow hallway that led to 2 bedrooms and a small bathroom. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and the ceiling sloped down, giving the space a slightly claustrophobic feel. Their bedroom was at the end of the hall, and as Sarah had promised, it had a large window that overlooked the forest. The room was simply furnished with two twin beds, a small dresser, and a knitstand. The window was open, letting in a cool breeze that stirred the curtains and brought with it the scent of pine and earth. "This is nice," Emily said, setting her bag down on one of the beds. "Peaceful." "Yeah," Sarah agreed, though her voice was distracted as she looked out the window. "Peaceful." Emily followed her gaze, her eyes tracing the line of trees that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The forest was thick and dark, the trees packed so closely together that it was impossible to see more than a few feet into the woods. The sun, which had been shining brightly when they left Riverside, was now obscured by clouds, casting the forest in shades of gray and green. "There's something about this place," Sarah said softly, almost to herself. "Something different." Emily looked at her friend, noting the slight frown on her face, the way her fingers drummed absently against the windowsill. "What do you mean?" Sarah shook her head, as if shaking off a thought. "I don't know. Just a feeling, I guess. Probably just the excitement of being here. Or the nerves," Emily suggested with a small smile. Sarah laughed, though the sound was a bit forced. "Yeah, maybe that too." They spent the next hour unpacking and settling in, the cabin slowly coming to life as the group moved around, exploring their new home. The kitchen was indeed well stocked, and Mike immediately started planning a big dinner for the evening, while Jessica rummaged through the bookshelf in the living room, pulling out old, dusty volumes and flipping through the pages with curiosity. Emily wandered around the cabin, taking in the details. The walls were lined with old photographs and paintings, most of them depicting the surrounding forest or the cabin itself. But there were a few that caught her eye, strange abstract pieces that seemed out of place in the rustic setting. One painting, in particular, drew her attention. It was of a group of people standing in a clearing, their faces blurred and indistinct, their bodies elongated and twisted in unnatural ways. "That's creepy," she muttered, stepping closer to examine it. "Find something interesting?" Mike asked, as he walked up behind her. Emily pointed to the painting. "Just this. It's unsettling." Mike squinted at it, then nodded in agreement. "Yeah, it is. Almost like the artist was trying to capture something not quite human." "Exactly," Emily said, feeling a chill run down her spine. "Probably just some local artist trying to be edgy," Mike said with a shrug. Though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced, they continued to explore, finding more strange and unusual items scattered throughout the cabin, old trinkets, faded photographs, and books with titles that seemed to hint at the supernatural. By the time they regrouped in the living room, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the floor and giving the cabin a distinctly ominous atmosphere. "Let's get a fire going," Sarah suggested, rubbing her arms as if to ward off a chill. "It's starting to get cold in here." Mike volunteered to start the fire, and soon the living room was filled with the warm glow of flames dancing in the fireplace. They gathered around, the flickering light casting eerie shadows on the walls as they settled in for the evening. "All right, everyone," Sarah said with a grin as she sat down with a glass of wine. "We're here to write, so why don't we start by sharing some story ideas? It might help get the creative juices flowing." "Sounds good to me," Jessica said, taking a sip of her own drink. "I've got a few ideas I've been working on." "Me too," Mike added. "This place is already giving me plenty of inspiration." Emily nodded, though she felt a bit of hesitation. The cabin, the forest, and the strange art on the walls had all sparked ideas in her mind, but there was also a sense of foreboding that she couldn't quite shake. Still, she pushed the feeling aside, determined to make the most of the retreat. One by one, they shared their ideas, each one darker and more twisted than the last. The fire crackled in the background. The shadows on the wall seemed to dance in time with their words, and as the night wore on, The sense of unease that had been lurking in the back of Emily's mind grew stronger. Finally, when the fire had burned low and their glasses were empty, Sarah stood up and stretched. "All right, I think that's enough for tonight. We've got a lot to work with, and tomorrow we can start putting it all down on paper." "Agreed," Mike said with a yawn. "I'm beat." They all headed to their rooms, the creaking floorboards and the howling wind outside the only sounds as they made their way up the stairs. Emily felt a twinge of anxiety as she closed the door to her room, the darkness outside the window pressing in on her. She could still feel that strange sense of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the edge of her perception, but she brushed it off, reminding herself that they were alone out here, far from the noise and chaos of the city. This was supposed to be a retreat, a place to relax and create, not a place to let her imagination run wild. Still, as she lay in bed, listening to the sounds of the night, she couldn't help but feel that they weren't as alone as they thought. The cabin settled into silence as the group drifted off to sleep, each of them exhausted from the day's journey and the anticipation of the retreat ahead. Outside, the wind had picked up, whistling through the trees and rattling the windows, but inside, the fire had died down to glowing embers, and the only sound was the soft creaking of the old wooden structure. Emily lay in her bed, staring up at the ceiling. The room was dark except for the faint moonlight that filtered through the window, casting pale beams across the floor. She had always considered herself a rational person, not easily spooked, but something about this place had her on edge. Maybe it was the isolation, or the strangeness of the artwork on the walls, but whatever it was, it made her uneasy. She closed her eyes, trying to push away the unease and focus on the excitement of the retreat. Tomorrow, they would start writing, and she was determined to make the most of the creative energy that this place seemed to hold. But as she drifted off to sleep, her mind kept circling back to the strange feeling. She couldn't quite shake the sense that something wasn't right. It must have been hours later when she woke up suddenly, her heart racing. The room was pitch black, the shadows deep and impenetrable. For a moment, she wasn't sure what had startled her awake. But then she heard a soft, almost imperceptible sound like something scraping against wood. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat as she strained to listen. The sound came again, a slow, deliberate scratching, like fingernails dragging across the door. She turned her head toward the sound, her pulse quickening. The door to the bedroom was closed, but beyond it, in the hallway, she could hear something moving. She sat up slowly, her heart pounding in her ears. The sound stopped, leaving only the faint creaking of the floorboards as the cabin seemed to settle around her. For a long moment, she sat there listening, waiting for the noise to come again. But all she heard was silence, probably just the wind. She whispered to herself, trying to calm her racing heart. This place is old, it's bound to make some noises. But even as she said it, she knew that wasn't quite true. The sound she had heard wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too controlled, like someone or something had been trying to get her attention. Emily glanced at the window, but the forest outside was a mass of darkness, the trees obscured by shadows. The sense of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the reach of the light, was stronger than ever. She thought about waking Sarah, but the thought of explaining why she was so spooked over a few strange noises seemed ridiculous. Taking a deep breath, she swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood up, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. She hesitated for a moment, then walked to the door and opened it just a crack, peering into the hallway. The hallway was empty, dark except for the faint glow of moonlight seeping in from the small window at the end. Everything was still, the only sound the soft whisper of the wind outside. Emily stood there for a moment, her hand gripping the doorknob, half expecting to see something move in the shadows, but there was nothing. She let out a shaky breath and closed the door, returning to her bed. "Just my imagination," she muttered, though the words did little to ease her anxiety. As she laid back down, she pulled the covers up to her chin, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, it was filled with restless dreams, dark, disjointed images of the forest, of shadowy figures moving through the trees, their faces hidden in the darkness. The next morning, Emily woke up feeling groggy and unrested, the memory of the night's strange sounds still lingering in her mind. She dressed quickly and headed downstairs, hoping a cup of coffee would shake off the last remnants of her uneasy sleep. To her surprise, she found Mike already in the kitchen, staring out the window with a frown on his face. He was usually the last to rise, always needing his full 8 hours of sleep. "Morning," Emily said, trying to sound cheerful as she filled a mug with freshly brewed coffee. "You're up early." Mike glanced over at her, his expression serious. "Yeah, I didn't sleep well. Did you hear anything weird last night?" Emily paused, her hand gripping the mug a little tighter. "Weird? Like what?" "Like scratching, or something moving around outside," Mike said, his voice low as if he were hesitant to even bring it up. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. "I did. I thought it was just the wind." Mike shook his head. "It wasn't the wind. I went outside to check, and there was nothing there. But I swear, it felt like something was watching me." "Did you tell anyone else?" Emily asked, her unease growing. "Not yet. I didn't want to freak everyone out. But I'm going to check around the cabin today, see if I can find anything." "Maybe it was just an animal," Emily suggested, though she didn't really believe it. "Maybe," Mike agreed, but his tone was doubtful. Sarah and Jessica joined them in the kitchen a few minutes later, both looking tired but otherwise unaware of the strange events of the night before. Emily and Mike exchanged a glance, silently agreeing not to bring it up for now. There was no point in worrying the others if it was just a figment of their imaginations. After breakfast, they all decided to take a walk around the cabin, partly to stretch their legs after the long drive, and partly to get a feel for the area. The morning was overcast, with thick clouds hanging low in the sky, casting the forest in a dim, gray light. As they walked, Mike kept a close eye on the ground, looking for any signs of disturbances. Emily stayed close to Sarah, trying to shake off the sense of unease that had settled over her. The forest was quiet, the trees standing tall and still, their branches barely moving in the wind. But despite the calm, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. They circled the cabin, finding nothing out of the ordinary. No tracks, no broken branches, no signs of anything unusual. But the sense of something lurking just out of sight remained, growing stronger with each passing minute. As they returned to the cabin, Sarah suddenly stopped, her eyes narrowing as she looked up at the roof. "What's that?" she asked, pointing to something near the chimney. They all looked up, following her gaze. There, half hidden by the overhang eaves, was a small, dark object. It was wedged between the chimney and the roof, almost invisible against the weathered wood. Mike frowned. "Hold on, I'll get a closer look." He quickly retrieved a ladder from the side of the cabin and climbed up, his movements careful on the slick roof. As he reached the chimney, he hesitated, then reached out and pulled the object free. "What is it?" Jessica called up from below. Mike climbed back down, holding the object in his hand. It was a small, crude carving, made from what looked like a piece of bone. The figure was rough, with a distorted, humanoid shape, its features twisted and exaggerated in a grotesque way. "That's disturbing," Emily said, staring at the carving with a sense of dread. "Where did it come from?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Mike replied, turning the carving over in his hand. "But it doesn't look like something that just got blown up here by the wind." "It looks old," Jessica said, leaning in for a closer look. "Like it's been here for a long time. But why was it hidden up there?" Emily asked, the unease in her chest growing. "And who put it there?" No one had an answer, and the discovery only deepened the sense of dread that had settled over the group. They returned to the cabin in silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Back inside, the atmosphere was tense. The discovery of the carving had rattled them all, even if no one wanted to admit it. The cabin, which had seemed cozy and inviting the day before, now felt oppressive, as if the walls were closing in around them. Sarah suggested they spend the day working on their stories, hoping to distract themselves from the strange events of the morning. But as they sat around the living room, notebooks and laptops open, the unease lingered, making it difficult for anyone to focus. Emily tried to write, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the strange noise she had heard the night before and the carving they had found on the roof. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something in the forest was aware of them, and it was only a matter of time before it made its presence known. As the day wore on, the clouds outside grew thicker, and by late afternoon, the sky was dark with the promise of rain. The wind had picked up again, rattling the windows and making the trees sway and groan. The air inside the cabin felt heavy, charged with an almost palpable tension. Just as the first drops of rain began to fall, there was a loud bang followed by a sharp crack. Everyone jumped, looking around in alarm. "What was that?" Jessica asked, her voice trembling. "It sounded like it came from upstairs," Mike said, already moving toward the stairs. Emily's heart pounded as she followed him, Sarah and Jessica close behind. They climbed the stairs slowly, the creaking of the floorboards the only sound as they approached the second floor. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the small window at the end. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet. As they reached the top of the stairs, they saw the source of the noise. The door to the bedroom at the far end of the hall was ajar, hanging off its hinges as if it had been slammed with great force. The wood around the lock was splintered, as if something had struck it with enough power to break it. Mike stepped forward cautiously, pushing the door open the rest of the way. The room beyond was dark, the curtains drawn tight, but as they entered, they could see that something had happened. The furniture was overturned, the bedclothes scattered across the floor. The window was open, rain blowing in and soaking the carpet. But there was no sign of what had caused the destruction. "What the hell happened here?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the wind and rain. "I don't know," Mike replied, his tone grim. "But whatever it wasn't just the wind." Emily's eyes were drawn to the wall opposite the window, where something had been scratched into the wood. She stepped closer, her heart pounding in her chest as she read the words carved deep into the wall. Asterisk, asterisk, leave now or never. Asterisk, asterisk. A chill ran down her spine, and she took a step back, her mind racing. Someone or something was warning them, but who and why? "We need to get out of here," Emily said, her voice shaking. "This isn't safe." "We can't leave in this storm," Mike pointed out, his voice steady but tense. "The roads are too dangerous." "Then what do we do?" Jessica asked, her eyes wide with fear. "We stick together," Sarah said firmly, though Emily could hear the tremor in her voice. "We stay downstairs, keep the fire going, and wait out the storm. Then we'll decide what to do in the morning." No one argued, though the tension in the room was palpable. They gathered their things and returned to the living room, the fire their only source of comfort against the growing darkness outside. But as the storm raged on and the wind howled through the trees, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there was waiting, watching, and it wasn't going to let them leave so easily. The storm outside raged with a ferocity that seemed almost unnatural, the wind howling through the trees and slamming into the cabin with enough force to make the walls shudder. The rain pounded on the roof like a relentless drumbeat, drowning out all other sounds except for the crackling of the fire. The group huddled together in the living room, their faces lit by the flickering flames, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Emily could feel the tension in the air, thick and oppressive, like the weight of the storm pressing down on them. They had been sitting in silence for what felt like hours, the only noise the occasional crack of thunder and the shifting of the logs in the fireplace. No one spoke, as if afraid that even the slightest sound would draw the attention of whatever was out there in the darkness. It was Sarah who finally broke the silence, her voice shaky but determined. "We need to figure out what's going on here. That carving, the noise last night, and now this." She gestured vaguely toward the ceiling, where the splintered door still hung from its broken hinges. "It can't be a coincidence." "It's not," Mike said, his tone grim. "Something's trying to scare us or worse." "Do you think it's the cabin?" Jessica asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, do you think it's haunted?" "Haunted, cursed? Whatever it is, it's not friendly," Mike replied, rubbing a hand over his face. "We need to be careful." Emily's thoughts were racing. She had read countless stories about haunted houses, vengeful spirits, and ancient curses, but this was different. This was real, and she could feel the fear gnawing at the edges of her sanity. The words carved into the wall kept replaying in her mind. Asterisk, leave now or never asterisk. It wasn't just a warning, it was a threat. "Maybe we should leave," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "Even if the roads are bad, it might be safer to get out of here." "We can't drive in this storm," Sarah argued, though Emily could see the fear in her eyes. "We'd be risking our lives on those mountain roads, especially in the dark." "But staying here might be even more dangerous," Emily countered. What if it doesn't want us to leave?" A heavy silence fell over the group as they considered the possibility. The idea that something malevolent was keeping them trapped here, toying with them, sent a shiver down Emily's spine. "We'll leave first thing in the morning," Mike finally said, his voice firm. "We'll pack up, get in the cars, and drive straight out of here. We'll deal with the storm if we have to, but we're not spending another night in this place." The others nodded in agreement, though Emily could see the doubt in their faces. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and the idea of driving through the mountains in these conditions was terrifying. But the alternative, staying in the cabin and facing whatever was out there, was even worse. They spent the next few hours huddled together, talking in low voices, trying to distract themselves from the oppressive atmosphere that hung over the cabin. But no matter how much they tried to stay positive, the fear lingered, a constant undercurrent in their conversations. As the night wore on, the storm seemed to intensify, the wind shrieking through the trees with an almost human-like wail. The fire flickered and sputtered, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls, and the temperature in the cabin began to drop, despite the roaring flames. "It's getting cold," Jessica said, wrapping a blanket tightly around her shoulders. "Is there another log we can add to the fire?" "There should be more wood outside," Mike said, standing up and heading toward the back door. "I'll grab some." "Be careful," Emily warned, her voice laced with concern. "We don't know what's out there." Mike nodded, though he didn't look particularly worried. He was the type to face danger head-on, preferring action over hesitation. But as he opened the back door and stepped outside, Emily felt a surge of anxiety. The wind howled, sending leaves and debris swirling around him, and the darkness beyond the small circle of light from the doorway seemed impenetrable. Mike returned a few minutes later, his arms full of logs, and quickly added them to the fire. The flames flared up, casting a warm glow over the room, but the warmth did little to ease the growing tension. As the group settled back down, the atmosphere in the cabin grew heavier, the oppressive feeling of being watched returning with a vengeance. Emily could feel the weight of it pressing down on her, a cold, gnawing fear that made her skin prickle. Then, without warning, the lights went out. The sudden darkness was absolute, the only light coming from the flickering flames of the fire. For a moment, no one moved, stunned into silence by the sudden blackout. Then, all at once, they began talking over each other, voices rising in panic. "What happened? Is it the storm?" Why would the power go out? It's the generator, Mike said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. It must have gone out? I'll go check. No, Emily said quickly, grabbing his arm before he could stand. Don't go out there. It's too dangerous. We can't just sit here in the dark, Mike argued, though his tone had softened. I'll be quick. If the generator's out, we need to fix it. Emily's heart raced, her mind flashing back to the strange noises, the scratching at the door, the ominous message carved into the wall. The idea of Mike going out into the storm, into the darkness where something was lurking, filled her with dread. I'll go with you, Daniel said suddenly, his voice calm but firm. It was the first time he had spoken in hours, and his offer surprised everyone. Mike hesitated, then nodded. All right, let's go. Emily watched them go, her hands trembling as she clutched her blanket. The door closed behind them with a loud thud, and then they were gone, swallowed by the storm. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, the only sound in the otherwise silent room. Emily's eyes darted around the cabin, every creak and groan of the old wood making her jump. What if something happens to them? Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible. They'll be fine, Sarah said, though she didn't sound convinced. They're just checking the generator. It won't take long. But the longer they waited, the more Emily's anxiety grew. Every shadow seemed to move, every gust of wind seemed to carry a whisper of something dark and malevolent. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something was waiting for the right moment to strike. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door burst open, and Mike and Daniel stumbled inside, soaked to the bone and shivering. The generator's shot, Mike said, his voice breathless from the cold. The storm must have knocked out the power lines. We're on our own until it passes. We can't stay here without power, Jessica said, her voice rising in panic. We need to leave. Now. We can't drive in this storm, Mike said, trying to calm her down. The roads are too dangerous. We'll have to wait it out. Wait it out. Jessica repeated, her voice tinged with hysteria. You saw what happened upstairs. We're not safe here. Calm down, Jess, Sarah said, though her own voice was trembling. We'll be fine. We just need to stay together. Emily could feel the tension rising, the fear and paranoia creeping into their minds. The cabin, once a place of refuge, now felt like a trap, a cage they couldn't escape from. And outside, in the darkness, something was waiting. Let's just stay by the fire, Emily suggested, trying to keep her voice steady. If we stick together, we'll be safer. The others nodded, though the fear in their eyes was unmistakable. They gathered around the fire, the flames casting long shadows on the walls, and huddled together for warmth. But the cold had seeped into their bones, and no matter how close they sat, the chill remained. Time passed slowly, the minutes dragging on as the storm battered the cabin. Every so often, the wind would pick up, rattling the windows and making the walls creak. But inside, the silence was almost unbearable, each of them too afraid to speak, to break the fragile calm that had settled over them. Then, without warning, there was a loud crash from upstairs, followed by the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. Emily's heart leapt into her throat, and she shot to her feet, the others doing the same. What was that? Jessica whispered, her voice trembling. I don't know, Mike said, his eyes wide with fear, but it came from upstairs. We need to check it out, Daniel said, though his voice wasn't steady. We can't just sit here and wait for it to come to us. No way, Jessica said, backing away. I'm not going up there. We can't leave whatever it is up there, Mike said, though his own fear was evident. If it's a person or an animal, we need to deal with it. Emily's mind raced, torn between the fear of what might be waiting for them upstairs and the knowledge that they couldn't ignore it. Whatever was in the cabin with them, it wasn't going to leave them alone. Okay, she said finally, her voice trembling. Let's go check it out. But we stay together. The group nodded, and slowly they made their way up the stairs, each step creaking under their weight. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from a small flashlight that Mike had found in one of the kitchen drawers. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the narrow hallway and the door at the end, the same door that had been broken earlier. As they reached the top of the stairs, Emily's breath caught in her throat. The door to the bedroom was wide open, the darkness inside almost impenetrable. But there was something else, something that made her blood run cold. The words carved into the wall were gone. "Where are they?" Sarah whispered, her voice filled with fear. "I don't know," Mike said, his voice tense, "but something's not right." They moved closer, the flashlight beam flickering as it passed over the empty walls. The room was in disarray, the bed overturned, the furniture scattered. But there was no sign of the words, no sign of anything that could explain the noise they had heard. Then, from behind them, there was a soft, almost inaudible whisper. "Leave now." Emily spun around, her heart pounding. The hallway was empty, the darkness beyond the beam of the flashlight complete. But she could feel that something was there, just out of sight, watching them. "Did you hear that?" Jessica whispered, her voice shaking. "Yes," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "We need to get out of here." "Now," Mike agreed, his voice tight with fear. They didn't need any further encouragement. The group turned and bolted down the stairs, their footsteps echoing through the darkened cabin. Emily's heart raced as she ran, the fear clawing at her mind, urging her to flee. They reached the living room in seconds, the fire now nothing more than a pile of glowing embers. But as they reached the door, a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread washed over Emily, freezing her in place. The door wouldn't open. Mike pulled at the handle, yanking with all his strength, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if something on the other side was holding it shut, keeping them trapped inside. "We're locked in," Mike shouted, his voice tinged with panic. "We can't get out." The others crowded around, their fear mounting as they realized the gravity of the situation. They were trapped, locked in a cabin with something that didn't want them to leave. "Try the windows," Emily said, her voice frantic. They ran to the nearest window, but it too was stuck, the frame swollen with moisture from the storm. The others were the same, all of them sealed shut, as if the cabin itself was conspiring against them. "We're trapped," Jessica whispered, her voice filled with despair. "No," Mike said, shaking his head. "There has to be a way out." But even as he said it, Emily could see the fear in his eyes. They were trapped, surrounded by something they couldn't see, couldn't understand, and it wasn't going to let them go. As they huddled together in the darkened living room, Emily's mind raced. The words carved into the wall had been a warning, a threat, and now it was too late to heed it. Whatever was in the cabin with them was growing stronger, its presence more palpable, more terrifying, and there was no way out. The cabin's interior had become a prison, its once cozy and rustic charm now twisted into something ominous and claustrophobic. The group huddled in the darkened living room, their faces pale and drawn as the reality of their situation began to sink in. The storm outside showed no signs of abating, the wind howling like a living thing, while inside, the atmosphere was charged with fear and tension. Emily sat on the edge of the couch, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of what was happening. They were trapped, locked inside the cabin by some unseen force that didn't want them to leave. The words that had been carved into the wall kept replaying in her mind, a chilling reminder that they had been warned *, leave now or never *. But they hadn't left, and now it was too late. "We need to stay calm," Mike said, though his voice wavered as he spoke. He had taken charge by default, his natural inclination to lead kicking in, but even he was visibly shaken. "Panicking isn't going to help us. We need to think logically." "Logically," Jessica repeated, her voice trembling. "How do we think logically about something like this? This is insane." "I know," Mike said, trying to steady his own nerves. but we have to keep it together. We can't let this thing, whatever it is, get to us. Sarah was sitting beside Emily, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly. What if it's not just the cabin? She asked quietly, her eyes darting toward the darkened windows. What if it's the land, the forest around us? Maybe it's something ancient, something that was here long before this cabin. Emily felt a chill run down her spine at Sarah's words. It made sense in a twisted, terrifying way. The land, the forest, it all felt old, ancient in a way that was hard to describe. As if the trees themselves were alive, watching, waiting. But why us? Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why now? I don't know, Sarah replied, shaking her head. But maybe it's because we came here. Maybe we disturbed something, and now it's angry. That doesn't help us right now, Daniel said, his voice tense. He had been quiet since their escape from the upstairs hallway, but now the fear in his eyes was clear. We need to figure out how to get out of here, but we've tried everything, Jessica said, her voice rising in panic. The doors won't open, the windows won't budge, we're trapped. There's got to be a way out, Mike insisted, though he didn't sound convinced. Maybe we're missing something. The group fell silent, the weight of their situation pressing down on them. Emily's mind raced, trying to find a solution, some way to escape the nightmare they had found themselves in. But the more she thought about it, the more hopeless it seemed. They were trapped, at the mercy of something they couldn't see or understand. Then a thought struck her, a memory, something that had been nagging at the back of her mind since they had arrived. The journal, Emily said suddenly, her voice cutting through the silence. The others turned to look at her, confusion and fear etched on their faces. What journal? Mike asked, frowning. In the bookshelf, Emily explained, her heart pounding as the pieces began to fall into place. When we first arrived, I was looking through some of the books. There was an old journal, hidden behind some of the other books. I didn't think much of it at the time, but maybe it has something to do with this. We need to find it, Sarah said, standing up. It might tell us what's going on. The group quickly moved to the bookshelf, their fear momentarily forgotten as they searched for the journal. Emily pulled out the books one by one, her hands shaking slightly as he did so. Finally, she found it, a small, leather-bound book, its cover worn and faded with age. Here it is, she said, holding it up. They gathered around the fireplace, the journal lying on the table before them. The fire had been stoked with the last of the wood, casting a warm glow over the room, though the chill in the air remained. Emily opened the journal carefully, the pages yellowed and brittle with age. The first few pages were filled with handwritten notes, the ink faded and difficult to read. The handwriting was neat but cramped, as if the writer had been in a hurry. It's a journal from someone who stayed here, Emily said, her voice hushed as she scanned the pages. They were here a long time ago. They wrote about strange things happening in the cabin. Like what? Mike asked, leaning in to read over her shoulder. Voices in the night, objects moving on their own. They wrote about feeling like they were being watched, like something was in the cabin with them. Sounds familiar, Sarah murmured, her eyes wide with fear. Emily flipped through more pages, the entries becoming more frantic, the handwriting more erratic. They talk about seeing things, shadows, figures in the woods. They wrote about the land being cursed, that something ancient lived here, something that had been disturbed. The group exchanged nervous glances, the atmosphere growing even more tense. Emily could feel her pulse quicken as she continued to read, the words on the page filling her with a growing sense of dread. The last entry, Emily hesitated, her voice trembling. The last entry says they tried to leave, but the cabin wouldn't let them. They were trapped, just like us. A heavy silence fell over the group, the reality of their situation sinking in deeper than before. Is there anything else? Daniel asked, his voice barely audible. Emily turned to the final page, her heart pounding. The handwriting was shaky, almost illegible. but the words were clear enough to send a chill down her spine. Asterisk, asterisk, it won't let us go. We're part of it now. We are the sacrifice. Asterisk, asterisk. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows in the corners darker and more oppressive. The fire flickered, casting eerie shapes on the walls, and for a moment, Emily could swear she saw something moving in the darkness beyond the circle of light. We're the sacrifice. Jessica whispered, her voice filled with horror. What does that mean? It means we're trapped, Mike said, his voice tight with fear. It's using us, just like it used them. This thing, whatever it is, it's feeding off our fear, our energy. But why? Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Why us? Maybe it doesn't matter who we are, Daniel said, his tone grim. Maybe it's the land, the cabin itself, that's cursed. Anyone who comes here becomes part of it, part of the curse. Emily closed the journal, her hands shaking. The revelation was almost too much to bear, the weight of their situation pressing down on her like a physical force. They were trapped, caught in a nightmare that had no end, no escape. We need to find a way out, Mike said, his voice filled with determination. There has to be a way. If we can figure out what this thing wants, maybe we can stop it. But how? Jessica asked, her voice breaking. We've tried everything, there's no way out. We're not giving up, Sarah said firmly, though the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. We'll find a way. Emily looked around at her friends, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes filled with fear. The storm outside showed no signs of stopping, the wind and rain battering the cabin with relentless force. But the real storm was inside, an unseen force that had trapped them in a place that should have been a retreat, a sanctuary. But it was anything but that now. The cabin was alive, in a way they couldn't fully comprehend, and it was hungry. We need to stick together, Mike said, his voice steady. Whatever this thing is, it's trying to divide us, to break us down. But if we stay strong, stay together, we can fight it. Emily nodded, though the fear in her heart was overwhelming. They were in a battle against something they couldn't see, couldn't understand. But they had no choice. They had to fight, or they would never leave this place. As they sat together, the journal lying closed on the table between them, the fire crackled softly, the flames flickering and casting long shadows on the walls. The air was thick with tension, the sense of being watched more palpable than ever. But even as the fear gnawed at the edges of her sanity, Emily knew that they had to stay strong. Because if they didn't, they would never make it out alive. The cabin felt like a living entity, breathing with the storm outside, its walls creaking and groaning as if straining against the malevolent force that had taken hold of it. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, the fear thick and suffocating. They were trapped, locked in a battle with something they couldn't see, something that had been waiting for them since the moment they arrived. As the hours ticked by, the group's resolve began to falter. The atmosphere in the cabin grew heavier, the darkness pressing in from all sides, and the fire that had been their one source of warmth and light was now a flickering, dying thing. The cold seemed to seep from the very walls, chilling them to the bone, and every creak, every rustle, sent waves of fear through the room. We need to find a way out of here, Mike said, breaking the tense silence. His voice was strained, his usual confidence eroded by the terror that surrounded them. There has to be a way, but we've tried everything, Jessica said, her voice trembling. She was curled up on the couch, a blanket wrapped tightly around her. Her eyes were wide and filled with a growing sense of hopelessness. The doors, the windows, nothing works. We're stuck here. Maybe there's another way, Daniel suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. He was pacing near the fireplace, his movements jerky and tense. Maybe something we missed. The journal said we're part of it now, Emily said softly, the weight of the words pressing down on her. That we're the sacrifice. But that doesn't make sense, Sarah said, shaking her head. She was sitting beside Emily, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Why would it need us? What does it want? To feed, Mike said, his voice low, on our fear, our energy. That's why it's doing this, why it's trying to break us down. Emily's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of information they had gathered. The journal, the strange occurrences, the feeling of being watched, it all pointed to something ancient, something that had been here long before the cabin was built. But what could they do against a force they couldn't see, couldn't fight? Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped sharply, the cold biting into their skin. The fire sputtered, the flames flickering wildly before going out completely, plunging the room into darkness. Emily gasped, her breath visible in the frigid air. "Stay together." Mike shouted, his voice cutting through the darkness. "Don't let it separate us." But even as he spoke, the shadows seemed to shift and move, swirling around them like a living thing. Emily could feel the presence growing stronger, pressing in on them from all sides. The darkness was suffocating, the air thick with fear and despair. Then, from the depths of the darkness, a voice emerged, soft at first, almost a whisper, but growing louder, more insistent. It was a voice that didn't belong to any of them, a voice that seemed to echo from the very walls of the cabin. "Give in," it whispered, the words wrapping around them like a vice. "You cannot escape. You belong to me now." Emily's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing as the voice filled her head. It was seductive, almost soothing, but beneath it lay a darkness, a hunger that threatened to consume them all. "Don't listen to it," Sarah shouted, her voice shaking. "It's trying to break us down, to make us give up." But the voice persisted, growing louder, more insistent, until it was a roar in Emily's ears, drowning out everything else. "Give in, you cannot win, you are mine." Emily clamped her hands over her ears, trying to block out the voice, but it was inside her head, digging into her thoughts, her fears. She could feel it pulling at her, trying to drag her down into the darkness, to make her surrender. "Fight it," Mike yelled, his voice strained with the effort. "Don't let it in." But the darkness was closing in, the voice growing stronger, and Emily could feel her resolve slipping, her fear overwhelming her. She could see the others struggling, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes wide with terror. The force was tearing them apart, breaking them down, feeding on their fear. And then, through the chaos, Emily remembered something: the journal. The final words written in that shaky, desperate hand. "We are the sacrifice, *. We have to fight back," Emily screamed, her voice cutting through the darkness. "It wants us to give up, to surrender. But if we don't, if we fight, maybe we can stop it." "How?" Jessica cried, her voice filled with despair. "How do we fight something like this?" Emily's mind raced, searching for an answer, something that could turn the tide. The presence was growing stronger, the darkness pressing in on them, but she could feel a flicker of hope, something they hadn't tried, something they could use. "The fire," she shouted, the idea hitting her like a bolt of lightning. "We need to light the fire again. It's the only thing that keeps it at bay." "But the wood's all gone," Mike said, his voice filled with frustration. "Then use something else," Emily said, her voice filled with urgency. "Anything, books, furniture, whatever will burn." The group sprang into action, each of them grabbing anything that could be used as fuel. Books, chairs, even the blanket from the couch. They'd piled it all into the fireplace, their hands trembling with fear and desperation. "Light it," Sarah yelled, her voice trembling as she held a match, her hands shaking. "Hurry." Mike struck the match, his fingers trembling as he held it to the kindling. For a moment, nothing happened, and Emily's heart sank, fear gripping her chest. But then, with a sudden whoosh, the fire caught, flames leaping up and casting the room in a warm, flickering light. The darkness recoiled, the presence that had been pressing in on them retreating, and for the first time since the storm had started, Emily felt a glimmer of hope. The fire was their only weapon, the only thing that could keep the darkness at bay. But even as the fire roared to life, Emily knew it wouldn't be enough. They couldn't stay in the cabin forever, feeding the flames with everything they had. They needed to find a way out, and they needed to do it fast. "We need to break the connection," Emily said, her voice filled with determination. "Whatever it is that's holding us here, we need to sever it. Maybe then we can escape. But how?" Daniel asked, his voice strained with fear. "What connection?" "The journal," Emily said, the pieces falling into place in her mind. "The last entry said we're the sacrifice. It wants us to give up, to surrender ourselves to it. But if we fight back, maybe we can break the curse." "How do we do that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Emily took a deep breath, her mind racing. The journal had hinted at something ancient, something tied to the land itself. The carvings, the strange occurrences, it all pointed to something that had been disturbed, something that wanted to be left alone. "We need to make it let us go," Emily said, her voice filled with resolve. "We need to show it that we're not going to be its sacrifice, that we're not afraid." "But we are afraid," Jessica said, her voice trembling. "We can't let it see that," Mike said, his voice firm. "We need to stand up to it, to show it that we're stronger than it thinks." The group gathered around the fire, their faces lit by the flickering flames. And for a moment, Emily could see the fear in their eyes replaced by something else: determination, strength. They were not going to give up, not without a fight. "Let's do this," Emily said, her voice steady. "Together." They stood up, forming a circle around the fire, their hands clasped together. The presence in the cabin was still there, still watching, waiting, but Emily could feel its grip weakening, its power waning. "Leave us alone," Emily shouted, her voice filled with defiance. "We're not afraid of you. We're not going to be your sacrifice." The others echoed her words, their voices growing stronger with each repetition. The darkness seemed to ripple, the shadows shifting as if in response to their defiance. The cabin shuddered, the walls creaking and groaning as the presence pushed back, but they stood their ground, refusing to be broken. The fire blazed higher, the flames reaching up toward the ceiling, and Emily could feel the presence retreating, its grip loosening. The air grew warmer, the cold that had seeped into their bones beginning to fade, and for the first time, Emily felt a surge of hope. "We're not yours," Sarah shouted, her voice filled with anger and fear. "We're not afraid of you." The cabin shuddered again, the walls seeming to close in around them, but the group held firm, their voices rising in defiance. "Leave us alone," Mike shouted, his voice filled with determination. "You can't have us," the darkness roiled, the presence pushing back with a final, desperate surge, but they stood strong, their fear replaced by a fierce determination to survive. The cabin seemed to groan, the very walls shuddering as the presence fought to maintain its grip, but it was no use. They were stronger than it had anticipated, their resolve unbreakable. And then, with a final, shuddering gasp, the darkness retreated completely, the presence vanishing as suddenly as it had appeared. The cabin was still, the oppressive weight lifted, and the fire burned brightly in the hearth, its warmth filling the room. For a long moment, the group stood in silence, their breaths coming in ragged gasps, their hearts pounding in their chests. The storm outside was still raging, but the cabin felt different now, lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. "Did we do it?" Jessica asked, her voice trembling. Emily nodded, though she could hardly believe it herself. "I think we did." They collapsed onto the couch, their bodies exhausted, their minds reeling from the ordeal. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, the warmth a welcome relief from the cold that had gripped them for so long. But even as they sat there, trying to process what had just happened, Emily knew that they couldn't stay. The cabin might have released its hold on them, but the storm was still raging, and the forest outside was still dark and dangerous. "We need to leave," she said, her voice filled with urgency. "As soon as the storm lets up, we need to get out of here." The others nodded, their expressions somber. They had survived the night, but the experience had left them shaken, their nerves frayed to the breaking point. "We'll leave at first light," Mike said, his voice steady but tired. "As soon as the roads are clear, we're out of here." The group settled in for the rest of the night, taking turns keeping watch as the fire burned down to embers. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside, the cabin was quiet, the oppressive presence gone. As dawn approached, the storm finally began to abate, the wind dying down to a gentle breeze, the rain tapering off to a light drizzle. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the windows, casting a pale light over the room. "We made it," Sarah said, her voice filled with relief. "We survived." The group gathered their things, their movements quick and efficient, their desire to leave the cabin behind palpable. The front door, which had been locked tight the night before, now opened easily, the cool morning air a welcome relief as they stepped outside. The forest was still and silent, the storm having left everything drenched and dripping. But the air was fresh and clean, the darkness that had surrounded them the night before gone. They loaded their cars in silence, each of them eager to put as much distance between themselves and the cabin as possible. As they drove away, the cabin receded into the distance, a dark shape against the backdrop of the forest, and Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of finality, as if they were leaving behind more than just a place. They were leaving behind a part of themselves. As they descended the mountain, the tension that had gripped them began to ease, the fear that had clouded their minds lifting like a fog. They had survived, but the experience had left them changed, each of them carrying the weight of what they had been through. Emily glanced in the rearview mirror, the cabin barely visible through the trees, and for a moment, she thought she saw something, a figure, standing in the clearing watching them go. But when she blinked, it was gone, the clearing empty. She shook her head, dismissing the thought as her imagination playing tricks on her. But even as they drove away, leaving the cabin and the forest behind, she couldn't shake the feeling that a part of the darkness had followed them, a shadow that would stay with them long after they had left. But they were alive, and that was what mattered. They had faced the darkness and survived, and now they were free. As the road stretched out before them, winding down the mountain and back towards civilization, Emily felt a sense of relief wash over her. They had made it through the night, through the fear and the darkness, and now they were heading home. But even as she tried to focus on the road ahead, the memory of the cabin lingered in her mind, a dark shape against the backdrop of the forest, a place that had held them captive, fed on their fear, and almost taken everything from them. But they had fought back, and they had won. And as they drove away, leaving the past behind, Emily knew that they would never forget the nightmare they had faced, the darkness that had tried to consume them. But they had survived, and now they were free, for now.